Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome back and Happy New Year to everyone. Thanks for joining the first event of the new year of 2026. I'm Andrew Bell. I'm a senior research scholar here at CSAC, and I am delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Rachel George, who's a lecturer in international relations here at Stanford and also affiliated with CSAC as well. And she is also a non-resident scholar with the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace and a research fellow at Georgetown's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. She's also been the director of education content at the Council of Foreign Relations and a research fellow at the Overseas Developmental Institute, ODI, in London. So she has a great background both in scholarship and also applied policy work as well. So I'm very excited to hear her talk today. I encourage you to check out her website to learn more about her background. She does a lot of interesting work on a lot of different topics. But in the interest of time, I will save that and turn it over to her to allow her to give her talk today. So thank you very much, and join me in welcoming Rachel.
Thanks, Andrew, so much. And it's so good to see you all here in the new year. It's already a very exciting year for foreign policy, and I'm personally excited. We have a little bit of time to talk about this topic among many other really pertinent ones happening today. My presentation today is focused on an issue very close to me of aid diplomacy mergers. My research principally looked at this issue in other countries around the world. I'll talk to you a little bit about more about those today. But of course, the topic potentially, unfortunately, has renewed pertinence here in the US. So while my presentation today is really focusing on other countries' experiences, I'm absolutely excited with the expertise here in the room and at CSAC to think about the applications of these findings here in the US, even talk about some preliminary findings about how this is playing out here with the closure of USAID. So very open to thinking about implications here at home, with the caveat that my research really focused externally. Let's kick off. I hope to ground us in a bit of time travel going back to 2020. So I was based at the time in London. I had just finished up my PhD at the London School of Economics. And I was working at an organization Andrew mentioned called ODI, the Overseas Development Institute in London. There were some really interesting foreign policy reforms happening in the UK at the time. There was the sort of dawn of the COVID-19 pandemic. You saw the Ukraine war kind of embroiling Europe, and also the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And of course, the Boris Johnson administration made some changes. You probably know about Brexit and all that happened there. Potentially not so high in the headlines here in the US, but very high in the angst of foreign policy elites in the UK was another reform. When Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the closure of DFID, the Department for International Development, he came out in a big press conference and declared that one cardinal lesson of the pandemic is that the distinctions between diplomacy and overseas development are artificial and outdated. He goes on to shut down, which was for many quite a beloved institution called DFID. He merges it into what was once called the FCO, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, creating what I call in my research a global affairs mega bureaucracy dedicated to multiple things at once, and creates the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which aims to merge what he saw as an artificial distinction between two domains, creating one bureaucracy instead. And I was curious at the time because a lot of my foreign policy and security scholarly and practitioner community saw this as kind of an interesting change, but didn't see it as potentially hugely consequential. Some of them saw it as the potential elevation of aid into their work. They were interested in the change. They were kind of excited about the change. Of course, snap to my development colleagues, and they were absolutely up in arms. People saw this as a hostile takeover, the end times of aid, the death of aid. It was like I was in parallel universes. The security folks I was talking to thought, this is neutral at best, maybe a good thing. The development folks I talked to were up in arms. So as a scholar kind of sitting between the two worlds, I was wondering, well, how should I think about this? Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it neutral? What does it mean? And the scholars that I was looking to didn't necessarily have a great answer for me. When I dug in a little bit more, I realized, as I'm sure everyone, all the sort of experts here in the room might be really well familiar, that it was actually a reflection of a growing trend. And if you looked outside the UK bubble at the time, the UK was actually lagging in what was happening with some interesting pace around the world. If you went back a few decades, the integration of development and diplomacy was actually somewhat common in some of the Nordic countries. You see Denmark and Norway having a more integrated approach to having development administration inside the MFA, inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Around 2009, we see a kind of more controversial moment. Australia announces the end times of USAID. No longer do we have this logo in the world. Instead, there's a mega bureaucracy that deals with aid and also elements of trade and foreign affairs. New Zealand quickly follows. We then see Canada around 2013. The closure of CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, is no longer. We now have something called GAC, I think a way less good acronym, Global Affairs Canada, that aims to deal with a whole host of issues related to development and other issues as well in foreign policy. So the UK was actually, I think, solidifying what I see as a really interesting trend in foreign policy. And in fact, I started my project in 2020 when this was happening because I wondered, well, what do we know? What happens when you close down a semi-autonomous or somewhat independent aid agency and bring it into a Ministry of Foreign Affairs? The reason I'm sure potentially some of you might be thinking about this was at the time I thought, well, could this happen in the US? And indeed, of course, we see the closure of USAID happening in the second Trump administration. The first Trump administration did flirt with the idea. It was quickly shut down. So in my research, I talked a little bit about why we should care about this and maybe learn from other countries. If we're going to merge, could we do it in a better way? So indeed, because of what happened here, I would not necessarily classify what happened here in the US as a full merger. We could talk about the details, but it has some of the component parts. I wrote about this a little bit in Foreign Policy, and I have a piece in the Washington Quarterly that looks a little bit at these issues. But again, my research, as I mentioned earlier, is focused on other countries. So these are some preliminary thoughts. I think it's too soon to do a full post-mortem analysis. The reforms are still happening here in the US, but I think it adds some pertinence to why we really need to care about what happens when mergers occur. What are some of the insights and practices that might, if you're going to merge, mean you can do it better or worse? So that's some background behind my research. So I'd like to set out a few ideas for our conversation today. The first, I'm going to lay out some of the concepts and sort of methodologies I have had around thinking about mergers of aid and diplomacy agencies. The next, I'm going to present in my research how I've thought about some of the logics behind these mergers. So we're seeing more and more of them. Why? What are some of the political arguments that are undergirding these changes? And finally, so what? So when a merger happens, what does that mean? And because we're here with CSAC, I know we have colleagues from some other departments and centers as well. I think it's really interesting to focus especially on questions of security, given some of the narratives I'll talk about a little later on. So let's start with the hard part, the conceptual kind of underpinnings of how we might think about these reforms. There's, of course, a really interesting, really long history of thinking about aid, foreign aid, international development, the many layers of what that means and its relationship to foreign policy. There's an interesting Marco Rubio today talks a lot about aid serving the national interest. There are different ways to think about this relationship, whether aid should be, fundamentally more altruistic, what place it has in a country's security apparatus or foreign policy. But it's probably no surprise to those here in the room that for the most part, aid has long been framed in service of the national interest. Of course, there are altruistic elements, there are human rights arguments, there's ways that aid is often framed to be supportive of other sort of more moralistic goals. But aid's foundations and origins have long been, of course, in some service of the national interest. So it's not necessarily a groundbreaking change. And again, as scholars here will know better than I, it's kind of early origins in the Marshall Plan. The reconstruction of Europe and its expansion through Cold War politics of influence really lays this bare. I'm not myself a historian, and I won't do a good job of giving you the full history of aid, but I do think it could be helpful just very quickly to do kind of a whistle-stop tour of some of the trends that we've seen before what I see as the new trend happening today. Around the 1960s, you see the creation of USAID, the sense that there should be a somewhat semi-autonomous institution that deals with some of the fundamentals of development assistance, foreign assistance abroad. We later see equivalents pop up all over the world. Most European nations start to build their own autonomous or semi-autonomous aid institutions. USAID, as we know, is one hub that long existed in the US for development policy and programming, but of course, foreign aid was channeled through a number of other institutions. A constellation of actors have long been involved in aid. Through the 1980s, we see sort of some changes and trends happening in aid administration, the rise of structural adjustment programs, the IMF, the World Bank. There's the dawn of the concepts of aid for trade and tied aid, different views of how you might have aid conditionality to, again, service the national interest, if you think of that from sort of a trade perspective. You see the rise of the Millennium Development Goals and the real sort of ballooning and expansion into the Sustainable Development Goals. There was primarily for a long time a focus on poverty reduction, infrastructure development, that was core to foreign assistance and development programming. Through the Sustainable Development Goals, we then see it being tied to a host of connected issues, sustainability, human rights, governance, institutions. So aid has never been a very simplistic, single sector issue, but certainly you've seen an expansion in some ways of how it's been integrated into other domains and areas. You also see rising private investments, the results management agenda, the rise of China's Belt and Road, the rise of alternative donors. At the same time, you see aid skepticism. So this is nothing new. There have long been critiques of aid, how it's going from the West to the rest, how there's actually unintended damaging effects of aid policy, calls for more localization, longstanding aid critiques. I think they have reached to some degree a fever pitch. This is probably informing the trend that I analyze in my research. But to say there's something completely new, I think would be a mistake. So with that history in mind, how could we think as political scientists or scholars about these mergers? So I think there's a fantastic political science research that could underpin different ways of analyzing the merits and drawbacks of different ways of conducting aid administration. Of course, there's incredible research, much of it coming from here at Stanford, on the connectivity between development outcomes and security outcomes. We know empirically there's really strong linkages or really interesting linkages between a host of development outcomes and different security outcomes. So for example, reductions in poverty are linked to reduced instances in civil wars, improved practices in terms of anti-corruption metrics are linked to better security outcomes, women's rights linked to security outcomes, beneficial security outcomes as well. There's also a really great book. My colleague Sarah Bermeo at Duke has worked on targeted aid as a form of foreign policy, how aid has really helped countries advance some of their security goals. You have great work that's talked about aid as a form of soft power. We don't necessarily have consensus on how to measure this, but we know that a lot of scholars have different ways of conceptualizing how aid has served the national interest in different ways of measuring a nation's soft power and the ultimate security impacts that can flow from that. There's also been really important work in political science that's talked about the securitization of aid. Some see this as a really negative thing. Aid has been increasingly dispersed within securitized frameworks. There's a really good study from Lozelle and Petrikova who have looked at this since September 11th. There's a sense that aid has been more explicitly channeled to countries that have a security purpose for the donor country. And I think there's some good empirical measures that have tested that. And so while I think political science has done a really good job of helping us think through these questions conceptually, what I think we're missing and the gap that my research seeks to fill is the institutional implication of this. So if these are really connected domains, how should we deal with them institutionally? So should institutions separate or combine aid administration with other domains? That's sort of the fundamental question in my research. And this is kind of stemming from what might be familiar. I'd be curious to learn from all of the expertise here. Are you thinking about these questions in your own work? I hear when I talk to policy scholars all the time, the adage that we need to bridge divides between these sectors. So long before I was looking at institutional mergers, it was really common to hear that development and foreign policy are too far apart. One of the quotes that I like that kind of, I think, encapsulates this argument, which I find common in Washington, comes from Alison Miner. She was in the US government, but at the time she was at Brookings, and she said there's way too large a divide between these two domains. The fields are weaker because of it. And because they are deeply interconnected, the experts are unfortunately speaking past each other. They're using jargon, they have separate cultures, they create echo chambers, and this is damaging. She argues we need to do more to bridge those divides. So this is kind of a common refrain. In the other countries I research, we see this call a lot. And of course, there's different ways of thinking about what to do to bridge divides, right? So it's not just a merger. You might think about interagency process, so things like the Quadrennial Development and Diplomacy Review here in the US, the elevation of Samantha Power as USAID Administrator to the National Security Council, the Global Fragility Act. These are different examples where there's some sort of effort to cohere, synergize, bring the domains together in sort of the working functions of government. The UK has the Integrated Review, which also puts a lot of credence into thinking about the connections between development and diplomacy. But it doesn't quite resolve, again, the central question, should development and diplomacy be one agency or two? And before I get into some of the study findings, I thought I'd give a moment to an interesting outcome from a workshop I held at Duke University when I was based there in 2023. I filled the room in a workshop, a round table, with about 50% of the participants labeled themselves as sort of principally working on diplomacy, security, foreign policy, sort of the umbrella that might be in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. About 50% of the room in the workshop was then development actors who labeled their work as somehow related to international development. And I asked them some pretty basic questions. How would you define the work that you do? What are the goals? What are the ways of working? How would you define the other person's domain? And is that similar or different to how your colleagues might do so? And potentially unsurprising to those in the room, it was a really hard exercise. So while there are some areas that most practitioners and policymakers agree distinguish the two domains, there's also a lot of ways in which people see them as quite blurred. So for example, diplomats liked to describe their work as primarily working in the political domain, while development actors talked about economic and social supports as fundamental to their work. But when you really dug into it, the development practitioners love to talk about thinking and working politically, engaging more on the political level to have more impact. And the diplomats really thought that thinking about these other conditions are really critical to their work as well. So you started to see them blur. Same with thinking about the site of action. Diplomats might think of their work as principally more high level and national. Development practitioners think about working more at the local level. But in fact, there's a ton of work being put into subnational diplomacy, thinking about localization across these different areas. So it's not a very bright line. You think about remedial or more crisis response work in diplomacy and potentially development being more preventive, more environment building. But again, I think that line is not a very clear differential. Diplomats tend to leverage power. Development folks tend to work more on leveraging finance. Diplomats are more policy forward. Development people work more on program level. Diplomats tend to prize secrecy and discretion. Development practitioners are more public facing, more focused on public oversight. Diplomats tend to prize generalists. Development practitioners tend to prize specialists. So these are some of the distinctions that came up. But when you talked about their goals, they were pretty closely connected. In the main, on both sides of the equation, people talked about goals of enhancing security, sustainability, economic prosperity, and human rights. So the logic extends that if you see not a very clear distinction between the two, and or if you believe that these are hyper interconnected practices, there could be an argument to bring them under one agency. In my research, I talk about three logics that could undergird these reforms. The first is a security logic. So you might come into this question and think, well, I'd like to align aid with the strategic interests of my country. Bringing this into one agency will help streamline this process and enhance my strategic goals, thought within a security framework. The second logic is an efficiency logic. So we might want to have one agency in order to reduce duplication and fragmentation. The third is a political logic about increasing ministerial control and coherence. These might look familiar. I think here in the US, you could potentially see all three. You might think of DOGE with the chainsaw. You might think of, very politicized arguments, but sort of efficiency, security, they're all framed in the way we've seen both the Trump administration in general and Marco Rubio's statements using rhetoric across all three logics. I find the logics tend to take more prominence in different ways based on different political contexts, but you do see a thread often of a combination of the three. So let's jump into some of the findings from my study. So I've conducted interviews with civil servants around the world, practitioners, academics. Mainly I was doing the work from about 2020, 2021 up to 2023, but I kind of rebirthed some of the interview work here in the USA around 2025 since January last year, once we saw some of the changes unfolding. Again, that's early stages. I don't have the benefit yet of hindsight here in the US. Otherwise, the cases you see here that I was looking at include Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Denmark, and Norway. I looked around to see what we could find from existing work that's looked at these mergers. In Australia, there's really great policy analysis from someone called Richard Moore. He used to work at USAID. He's done a really interesting post-mortem of what happened there. So I've worked a bit with him on the case of Australia. In terms of the UK, there's been a really great book that just came out called The Rise and Fall of DFID that came out of CGDev, the Center for Global Development. But I try to plug those gaps, applying a similar methodology across all the cases and try to identify some of the metrics we can look at to try to think through how could we measure the effects of these mergers. So let's give this a try and think about how we can measure the impacts of these mergers. So one metric is spending. So overall, in the metrics I'm going to show you in a moment, these mergers are associated with reductions in aid spending overall. There are some outliers, I'll show you those in a moment as well, but generally, if agencies merge their aid apparatus into a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, aid spending reduces. In a similar vein, there's a 0.7% of gross national income target globally agreed by most Western aid donors to maintain. The world sort of came together. The wealthy Western countries said, we'd like to give at least 0.7% of our GNI to aid. Most countries do not meet that goal, but after mergers, fewer do. So it tends to reduce in terms of hitting the target. And you also tend to see these reductions happening as security budgets either stay the same or rise. It's not very easy to note a replacement effect fully. So you don't necessarily, I think, know that as aid spending dips, that same earmark money is going to a security budget, but there is an impression among some of the civil servants I talked to that that effect could be happening. So let's have a look at what this looks like in a few country cases. So starting with Australia, you see, I think, one of the most dramatic examples of this effect. Aid spending there had never met the 0.7% GNI target. It hovered around 0.3. You saw some ebbs and flows. The merger happens around 2013. At that time, you see a pretty precipitous, dramatic dip. Aid spending has never since recovered. So the closure of USAID there is a pretty slam dunk case that in this setting, political context, budgetary moment, it was associated with a pretty large dip, and it's long had an effect. If you see that as being in some relation causal, that has never recovered. Let's turn to the UK. The UK is a super interesting case for this as well. The UK around 2013 enshrines in its national law that it commits to meeting the 0.7% GNI target. They actually made it domestic law that they would commit this much money to aid spending. Around Boris Johnson's announcement of the merger in 2020, we see aid spending dip. It is not as dramatic as we saw in the case of Australia, but it's still notable. It has not since recovered, and you've probably seen headlines that there have been further cutbacks in the UK in the past year. Let's look at a few of the outlier cases. So I have two to present maybe a slight nuance to the argument. The first here on the left-hand side is Canada. Canada has a merger around 2013. They see a dip in aid spending happening around the time of the merger, the time following the merger. It hovers somewhat low, but it does recover. So there is one case where you see the dip happen and there's an ultimate recovery. So I think that's important to have a look at. And finally, the extreme outlier case is Norway. Norway has an integrated approach. NORAD sits with a semi-autonomous function inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There is sort of an interesting dip that happens around the time of integration, but since then, aid spending has sort of soared. I'll talk to you a little bit about why I think Norway is a more interesting institutional design and case that might explain some of that outlier effect, but it is important to note as well. So how can we think about dips in aid? These are really only one metric of thinking about the effects of mergers. So if mergers tend to cause aid spending to dip, what does that mean for security? Well, there's the theory, as I presented a moment ago, that this might mean there's an underinvestment in aid in favor of some other security investments. It generally indicates some sort of deprioritization of aid in the new ministry. I'll talk about why I think that is in a moment. But I think there's an important counter argument here. Just because you're reducing aid spending doesn't necessarily mean you have dips in aid effectiveness. The theory could be that you're just being smarter about spending money, you spend less, you have more impact, right? So just because aid money is reducing doesn't give us a full picture, but it gives us a hint of what might happen post-reform if you look at what's associated with mergers and some of that aid spending data. Let's turn to the next way we can think about the effects of these mergers, though. Spending is just, of course, one dynamic, one slice of the cake. Another relates to expertise. So this is where the interviewees had, I think, a lot of really rich data to share, but are a little harder to capture in quantitative metrics. Overall, mergers tend to be associated with reductions in aid-focused staff in favor of diplomatic workforces. And you do see reductions overall in almost every case of aid-focused senior level posts. So there's a rebalancing that tends to happen post-merger. This means that you see changes in skill sets. There's definitely a change towards more specialism. More generalism, because specialism in development practice, you tend to put people in the field, for example, for many years. You have language expertise, you have connections, local knowledge and context. Diplomats, as you know, tend to rotate around the world, and there's strengths to both. So there's this sense that you need sort of global knowledge, you need to have multiple layers of experience and skills to work in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but there's a tension here. So you tend to see the reduction in specialists towards more generalists post-merger. You see technical skill sets change as well. Related partnerships seem to change as well. So where development folks might have had connections, local actors that they worked with a lot, these tend to sever when you have the reforms happening. And I'll talk about that a little bit in respect to a few cases shortly. But if you look in terms of senior posts, Australia provides a really interesting case. Of 16 senior executive officers that departed after their merger, 13 were USAID staff. So they really had the sense that the cuts were targeting the development sector, the hierarchy, the leadership that tended to host that expertise, but also have that influence reduced relative to the diplomatic corps. So you saw sort of a sense of an unbalance. Another way to think about this is what does this do for efficiency? Because remember, there's this efficiency logic. The merger is really going to help potentially save money, make more effective, efficient foreign policy. But here there are some warning signs about maybe how not to go forward with a merger. I think it's important to calculate when you think about cost efficiencies, the costs that come from the merger. The UK gives a really interesting case here. There have been some estimates that the merger itself cost some 25 million just in a few years. These include direct expenses like staff, consultancy pay, IT expenditures. But the estimate here from an audit office review said there's probably many indirect costs that can stem from disruption, like reduced productivity, startup costs. And I think here a lot of the interviewees I spoke with talked about this being really damning. So a lot of the ways they described just the chaos that was happening inside the agency cost people time, cost money. So it's another way to think about measuring the costs. I think another really interesting lesson from the UK case is simply ineffective leadership. So 7 transformation directors were in charge of the merger process in the UK. That's really not necessarily the most efficient way to transform something. One only served a few months, so they had a pretty chaotic process. So people I interviewed talked about this being a really uneven, inconsistent process for the integration. They also had a change in foreign secretary during the period. So there's a sense that the merger could have been a little more stable if you had one more consistent senior leadership with a clearer vision. A few more lessons I wanted to share that are emerging from the interview research. In the case of Australia, I had a really interesting set of interviews with people who talked about something that I call kind of productive counterpoint. In the book that I'm working on, I give a bit more credence to this case study, but I thought I'd give you just a sort of a tease of the way they describe some of these changes. So after the merger in Australia, Australia started to focus a lot on its Pacific neighborhood, its strategic influence there, both for development and diplomacy. But the former USAID civil servants that I interviewed talked about a distinction in their relationships with folks in the Pacific neighborhood they worked with. They talked about how they used to function as what they called trusted friends. So they used to come in and work with development organizations, NGOs, based in country that saw them as sort of a friendly ear, while the diplomats that flew in would stick to their political issues. They might want to call out human rights abuses and double down on trade priorities, but the development practitioners would be sort of seen as the good cop. And so there's a sense that we were able to actually have both roles, despite they might both bear the Australian flag. And they said after the merger, our partners saw us all the same. To me, this is interesting because, I mean, the sense that one government could be perceived on the ground differently depending on the type of agency they come from is compelling, but of course, they're all pursuing the national interest. We saw the political science, right? There's no sense that they're not pursuing the interests of Australia when they come in, but the civil servants did reflect and share that they saw that subtle difference, that it affected their ability to have influence in these interesting ways. In the US, some of the interviews that I've reignited over the past few months have talked also about concern about this. So there's a sense that productive counterpoint that used to happen at the interagency level because USAID leadership was able to have a space in the room that really represented the interests of development, enabled some sort of productive counterpoint. So when you might have some sort of trade-off between a development priority and a security priority, ideally those are synergized and mutually supportive, but of course in practice you might have to think about balancing different trade-offs. They're worried that this would disappear with the creation of one single agency. There are some interesting ways that civil servants I'm interviewing are talking about benefits, so I wanted to spend some time quickly sharing some of those thoughts as well. So there is an interesting theory, and there's some interesting sort of sociology behind this idea that co-locating civil servants inside a single building can actually help with trust building, mutual appreciation. Interviewees in Canada I spoke with did note this occurring. So co-locating in one physical office did create the sense of collegiality in some ways that respected other people's skills and approaches. The Canadians were fascinating in their interviews, saying you can tell right away when someone walks in the room if they're a development practitioner or policymaker because they dress different. And they said over time, those changes actually started to reduce because you're working in the same office, people's customs and habits start to align more. So these are sort of interesting effects you might want to think about. Some of the benefits shared with me in the interviews about Australia's merger, again, there are some definite warning signs about what happened in Australia, but some people said that there has been a benefit. Australia used to have a relatively global footprint. It's never been the biggest donor, but it's been a significant one around the world. Some people talked about the increase in coherence that happened when Australia basically post-merger decided to deprioritize its investments in Africa to solely focus strategically on the neighborhood it had in the Pacific region. And for many, this was actually a good thing because it helped them narrow their focus, not try to be spread too thin. Development practitioners and diplomatic colleagues were able to really focus together on, a more narrow specific region, and some cite this as a benefit. The UK also had an interesting set of benefits shared with me. I talk about this a little bit in the book as well, that in the UK, the Ebola response in Uganda was seen as some form of merger success. The FCDO at the time was able to deploy an integrated humanitarian, political, and technical response. It wasn't a very big one. They kind of had a few one-off investments, but they were fast. They had a lot of coordination, and people were sort of all working on the same team. When I probed the UK officials that I spoke with about this, they really attributed this a little more to the leadership at the time necessarily, more so than the actual institutional design itself, but they saw this as sort of micro wins that were happening. So there is some increased coordination benefit that you might see in certain forms of responses when people maybe are addressing the same or are kind of focused on the same regions. And I think these different cases maybe show different edges of that effect occurring. Lastly, in the UK, in the case of the FCDO, you saw some interesting cultural shifts happening. So while DFID had a more developed risk management, program management, supplier management function, the FCO had a more developed security culture. People there were known to have better influencing skills, and some people spoke of being able to draw on those strengths collectively once you had connected portfolios post-merger. So there are some downsides, some upsides. How can we really think about this? So one way that I propose in my research that we might want to think about what to make of all of this is, what does this mean for insecurity's root causes? So yes, there might be some benefits for mergers when you have increased coherence, maybe more narrowly defined vision for your security goals, but is that actually helping advance insecurity's root causes? So a counter argument in the case of Australia that was shared with me, that it was great that they were really hyper focusing on the Indo-Pacific region after the merger, but they were completely out of having any influence in Africa. Chinese start, ramping up their investments, and they've lost any competitive advantage there. So it definitely seems to be some sort of a trade-off occurring there. Key, I think, across all the interviews is this sense of reputational costs. So it's really, really hard to do a merger well and maintain relationships. And there's always some sort of reputational hit that tends to occur. And now this could be something that could be managed better, right? If you don't have 7 transformation directors, you have a more consistent process. There might be ways to think about not making this chaotic for in-country partners. We can think about what happened here in the US. So I think there's different ways to think about some process lessons there. The idea of productive counterpoint really seems central. So yes, while all the scholars I put in the room in that workshop said, oh, development, diplomacy, they're really very similar. We're kind of all in the same boat. We're driving in the same direction. Really, though, when you think at the agency level, if you just say we're doing all the same thing, you often sort of see the effect where they reduce to maybe the lowest common denominator. They don't really get into the granularity of how these activities might have some distinction or some trade-off. So that's the counterpoint argument shared in some of those cases. Finally, what the merger cases tend to demonstrate, a weakness that unfolds, relates to metrics and measurement. So while USAID, for example, had a really growing effort to really measure different goals and outcomes, for example, a target around localization, they very often failed to meet the goals they set out, but they tried to measure that. This State Department and Ministries of Foreign Affairs have lots of metrics too. They tend to not overmeasure or sort of measure in the same types of ways. But what usually doesn't happen is leadership, when they announce a merger, don't do a really good job of talking about how they're going to measure cohering and connecting their goals. So if when I interviewed different civil servants, they said, if I knew how my development activities were meant to be connected to my security goals, we had a really strong vision for how they're connected and a way to measure progress, that would have helped me understand the process better. So I think some lessons could be drawn there around how we measure and think about success post-merger. So how do we think about these lessons, where we are, given where we are today? I think there's a really interesting open question for us as scholars of foreign policy, security, to think about what is aid's rightful place in foreign policy. So there's a lot of attention, of course, this year because of what's happening here in the US. Is it the end times of aid for real? Are we talking fully about debt aid, the way Daniel Moyo used to talk about debt aid? But also, is aid an opportunity for more strategic foreign policy? And we do see different ways of thinking about this question around the world. The question I would raise here today is autonomous aid administration a figment of history? So if you looked at that trend line of mergers, it definitely seems to be the case that merging development and diplomacy is kind of the hip thing to do. It's really seen as passé to have an autonomous or semi-autonomous aid agency. But just look to Germany. Germany has thought about a merger recently and declined. It decided it will not go merger right now. You also see counterpoint in terms of non-Western aid approaches. In fact, alternative donors or incredibly actually influential donors around the world who have different conceptualizations of aid tend to separate their aid administration from their ministries of foreign affairs. So it is quite interesting to see what's trending here in the West is not trending elsewhere. And you even see maybe a counterpoint if you look at like Turkey and the Gulf states, which tend to separate their administration. There's also a question of emerging technologies. We're at CSAC, there's really great work thinking about this. Interviewees I talked to about these mergers had really interesting reflections about technology's role. So we know that technology is changing the security landscape. It's also changing the development landscape too. There are a lot of new threats, also a lot of new opportunities. But if you're interested in kind of the minutiae of bureaucratic practice, there's some hope that LLMs and different ways of deploying AI might help with some of the data gathering, data access, jargon, technical components that have divided these different domains. So for example, a lot of people said, well, all of my experience as a development practitioner is going to be lost if I'm merged into a foreign affairs agency. They don't know what I do. They don't speak the same language. But some find that actually, if we leverage technology to our benefit, we can become experts more quickly. We can bridge those divides if you talk about just the kind of the access to data information, but also to building up expertise. So there's some hope to leverage these to create more streamlined agencies. So I think it's yet to be seen, but I think it's an interesting question to think about if you think about the future of aid administration. So what do we make of all of this? The central question, of course, is are mergers a good idea? And I think, in the main, my research points to a very political sciencey answer that's a little bit hedgy, but we know that mergers tend to have some pitfalls. They tend to have some common flaws. Through the analysis I'm doing, I actually don't think that this proves that they're a bad idea in general. I think it's more the delivery of the merger. There could be a vision and a way of doing this that avoids the pitfalls, maximizes the opportunities. But what I would suggest is we don't have that quite yet. I do, in the book, I talk a little bit about Denmark and Norway. They have a bit more of a semi-autonomous structure inside the agencies. They've maintained the branding of Danida and NORAD. Their aid administration has sort of a bubble inside the ministry. These tend to be slightly more effective ways of doing it. Practitioners I talk to still say there's some downsides. So I think it's an interesting area to probe into more. We need more evidence on how bureaucratic design really shapes intended outcomes and more granular level strategies. So while there's a lot of political excitement around announcing a really big merger, it seems like a fun, easy, maybe thing to do, it very rarely deals on the granular level of how leadership is actually thinking about development's place in foreign policy, and how that is actually affecting strategic change. So mergers tend to be a blunt tool, but they don't necessarily do a good job of cohering at the practitioner level, and that's where I think we see more of the flaws coming through. And finally, in my research, I talk about avoiding the bureaucratic smokescreen, because a lot of these mergers happen in these heightened kind of political moments. They seem to be really easy ways to make promises towards some sort of efficiency gain. They're really distracting, I think, from the work that needs to be done at the more strategic and working level. So that's where I think it would be interesting for the sectors to move, to really avoid the trap of just looking at the bureaucratic smokescreen and really doing the hard work of looking behind it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Andrew, so much. I'm happy to talk about the other cases that are in my research, but if it's more interesting to talk about the US, love to learn from you all too about how you're thinking about this, and if it connects at all with any of the work that's happening here at Stanford. I know there's really great work on security development and everything in between. So yeah, excited to hear people's thoughts, and thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel, for a really fascinating discussion of your research. Looking forward to hearing some of the questions to tease out some of the themes that you found further. While you're thinking of your questions, I'll just take the chair's prerogative and start with the first one. I would love to know if in your interviews, did you find any evidence or any discussion from your participants regarding I think in terms of a bureaucratic framing or organizational theory framing as well, the impact of these mergers on the membership of the bureaucracies and particularly their morale or the effectiveness of those members as a part of these mergers. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if we look to Canada and the UK, there's a really interesting kind of dual-sided game that tends to play out. There's the immediate effect of uncertainty that I think really creates a damaging environment. So the way that the civil servants I interviewed talked about it to me is when it happens, I don't know my stakes here. I don't know if this means that all the hard-won relationships I'm going to be trying to preserve, my own position, the leaders that I trust will be completely disregarded. And usually that's not because it's been announced that that will happen, but the uncertainty creates a lack of trust that can be hard to repair. But there is a sense too that there's some sort of way that the reform process might help with that mutual understanding component. So when I talked to some of the development practitioners in the UK about the closure of DFID, they were kind of embarrassed. They didn't want necessarily everyone to know this, but they were kind of embarrassed to share that they had a bit of excitement around the idea that they would be in the FCO. They had a sense that DFID was sometimes sidelined. It was seen as a softer area, that they actually could have some teeth in what they do or some respect in FCO, but they didn't want to share it. It was seen as kind of like a naughty thing to think. So I think there's some really interesting dynamics that one could study if you're looking at these bureaucracies a bit more.
Very interesting. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, we'll open it up to the audience more generally. Keeping with CSAC tradition, we'll start with our fellows first, and then we'll open up more generally. So I guess, Emily, go ahead. Oh, sorry. We'll start with our fellow first. Emily, go ahead, yeah.
Hello, here at CSAC. And I just wanted to say, as somebody who studies bureaucracy, I really like, your question and your approach. And it's sort of a model for how to study what the impact of bureaucracy is on outcomes. I did want to kind of press you a little bit on the idea that these are good faith efforts to make aid better. And I'm sure you've gotten this question before, but to my mind, it's very easy to tell whether a merger or like any sort of bureaucratic reform is being administered and decided upon in a thoughtful manner and in good faith, right? Like Donald Trump was on record saying that the USAID was run by radical left lunatics. So I don't think anybody was and that's a direct quote. I don't think anybody was under the impression that this was a good faith effort to improve aid administration in the United States. And I don't know much about the Australia case, but it seems like that was decided upon pretty soon after Tony Abbott came into office. So I would like to know, have you looked at, like, are there different political circumstances that lead this way? And I was really interested, especially in the idea that non-Western countries, and I've studied Turkey a little bit, are doing the opposite, trending towards more autonomous aid administration. Is this just like different political circumstances that are leading to the outcomes that you're interested
in? And Maya, do you have a quick follow-up as well? Or?
Yeah, this is what my question was related to this. So a two-finger, if that's all right. Which is just to build on Emily's point to ask sort of what your normative frame is, because when you ask what criteria or when we ask, like, does this work? What is the intended aim? It seems like based on Emily's point, it'll be different depending on who you're talking to. And I think your assumption is kind of the liberal internationalist assumption. We want to improve aid, but also maybe security seems to still take some sort of primacy. So just a little bit more on the normative positioning.
Sure. Yeah, great question. Should I jump in? Yep. Yeah, these are really great questions, and curious in the room how people reflect on, I think, these really vital, central tensions in some of this project. So on the good faith efforts component, absolutely. So some of the research, I have a piece coming out in Global Studies Quarterly that's looking at the question of not necessarily the effects, but the motivation. So why we see the mergers in the first place. And it's true that they tend to be associated with conservative governments with pushes for austerity. So there's absolutely a politics around the mergers themselves. Where I try to add a little nuance and I see some maybe interesting tension, could zoom us into the case of Canada. So Canada did have the same pattern where a conservative government decides it's the end of CETA, they announce the merger. But it's the Trudeau government that goes ahead and actually delivers and further secures the merger itself. And that leads me to, I think, an interesting political science question, which is, are mergers some sort of path dependency? If you merge, does that mean you'll never demerge? And will a liberal government just go ahead and create an autonomous agency? So that's true. It can happen in the UK. They've had a merger, a demerger, a remerger. So you do see sometimes some of this. But for the most part, once a merger occurs, it tends to stick. And in fact, liberal governments have made arguments for them and said that they want and have an even greater vision for more deeply integrated and more deeply merged approaches. And I think the Nordic kind of more liberal regimes that have these integrations are a bit of a counterpoint too, but it's a really interesting tension. And on these questions of, the sort of normative basis, it's a really important one. I think where there's actually an interesting component and maybe a research agenda and an issue here is that we don't really have definitions of success, even among the let alone the person who announces the merger. They rarely have a definition they've put out of how they would define success or lack of success of the merger. But the domains aren't really great at defining success either. And I think that's where you have these really messy, again, like blunt choices, but there's really not a sense of if I reduce aid spending, that's a good thing or a bad thing. If I have some sort of narrow geographic focus, this is a good thing or a bad thing. So in my research, I try to be agnostic and just ask, how do the civil servants I talk to talk about success and failure? But I can probably do a better job of being more explicit about sort of where I'm coming from. And it's hard being in America now as an American who works in the development space to have some sort of objectivity there. But I'm trying, and maybe I'm not succeeding here, but in taking myself out of that picture and just trying to take the terms people share.
Okay, we'll open it up more broadly to the overall audience. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, one finger, and if you have a directly on point two finger, please let me know. I can call on you for that. Give your name, your affiliation, and also please make sure that your question ends with a question mark. So we'll start with you.
My name is Claude Ezron from a community. I'm wondering if a better approach to get the benefits from a merger without its drawbacks would be to organize at a high level rotations between civil servants who work in a foreign office and the ones who work in the AIDS administration, to have some kind of a cross-pollination between the two. Do you think it's a good idea? Have you seen it implemented in some countries?
That's a great question. So I didn't look very explicitly at that solution, but I find it compelling in an interesting way to kind of examine. There were a few examples shared with me in the case of Canada around secondments. So there was a sense that I spent some time in the development space. I'm a diplomat, but I understand how it works. I speak the language, I get them. I worked for them for a bit, or I was outside in civil society at an NGO and it benefited me. So I think it's a compelling and interesting point.
Yeah, Jim Goldgar from Hi. Thanks for the talk. So development assistance encompasses lots of different things. So I was just curious whether there are any patterns with respect when these things happen, when cuts are made to staff or cuts are made to programs. Are there any patterns with respect to what's kept?
Great question. So I've been testing for this and had some surprises. So one theory that I had going into the analysis is that given the reductions in maybe an emphasis on development broadly said, and you're absolutely right, it encompasses so many things. I had a theory that you might see reductions in humanitarian spending. So as you're maybe being a little bit more strategic, potentially that means sort of the more norm-based altruistic spending might be on the cutting room floor. I didn't find that effect. So it's a little bit hard to measure, but for the most part, I haven't seen that that's true. Another way I tried to test it is looking at women, peace, and security. So I tried to test gender-marked development spending. Does it reduce post-merger? Again, no effect. I think there is a sense that, as some of the studies I showed up there, there has been sort of at a large scale, the increasing securitization of aid spending. So there is, I think, a investment, if you look geographically in more strategically significant spaces, and an overall reduction in spending. But on that metric, I didn't see the effects I maybe expected to see. You do see a sense, though, that the rhetoric behind development loses some of its normative layers. So while, foreign direct investment, ways of thinking about aid and trade tend to take more primacy to thinking about maybe more humanitarian ways of working, I didn't see that coming out in the data itself.
Hey, in the back of the room, yep.
Hi, my name is Sitara Noor, and I'm a postdoc fellow at CSAC. So my question is about an important stakeholder in this aid business overall is the recipient country. How do you think this aid diplomacy merger is being seen in the recipient countries, and if there is some study being done in that regard specifically? And I also want to add that for a successful aid diplomacy, for aid to be successful, it actually serves as an extension of foreign policy. In certain countries, aid diplomacy also serves as an extension of security or military security policy as well. But for it to be successful, it should not be seen as such. And but in certain cases, it becomes quite visible, especially speaking from the recipient countries. So how do you think that merger helps in making aid look like just the aid, not an extension of foreign policy and not an extension of security policy for that matter?
Oh, that is such a really deep and interesting question. Maybe two quick responses. So first, unfortunately, to bound my study, I tried to some degree to have a slice of interviewees with more sort of local recipient countries, but for scope conditions really focus more on the donor country. So it's a real gap, and I think it would be a fantastic research agenda to do some of this work that really deeply looks at the recipient perspective. The question on like what it means to deliver aid and the sort of strategic layers is a really fascinating one. I don't have a great answer in full, but a few things came to mind. The first was, I think maybe some of you are familiar with this, but there's actually an empirical testing that's been done sometimes of the labeling of aid. And in fact, sometimes removing the USAID label or the flag or the actual political agenda component symbolically from the delivery of aid can have benefits. So while it might be counterintuitive, if you think about the national interest, you might think, well, I want to be seen as doing good in the world, dispersing as much food as possible. There have been strategic reasons why sometimes removing that label has some sort of benefit. It's not trusted. There's a really interesting complexity to that component. So I think your question around the perception of aid, if it's perceived as being altruistic, if it's perceived as being strategic, is a really fascinating one. And I do think theoretically the merger probably reduces that effect. And it leads me back to the example I shared where people said that I was a trusted friend. I was just the lowly development folk. I didn't wear a suit and tie. I came in, I was a development practitioner. I was treated differently. So there's a sense when you all have the same logo and you're all working for the same agency, that might disappear. I think there's probably some counter arguments that people know you're a USAID employee, right? You're not just some altruistic person coming in from nowhere. But I think it's a fascinating question.
Okay. Yes, in the back.
So I had a question. So I'm Veda Bethuri. Thank you. I'm Veda Bethuri. I am a student journalist with both an academic and journalistic focus on IR. And so I had a more world order / global politics question. So you talked a lot about the like intentions of these mergers and how they often come from conservative politics and conservative governments. And so specifically talking about the merger in the US, I wanted to get your perspective on how this ties into the sort of new world order that's a lot of political science scholars are sort of seeing becoming a thing like around the world. Trump is trying to like make like the three hemispheres of like the three hemispheres of power. Like the US controls like the Americas, Russia controls like Europe, and China controls like Asia, the Asian hemisphere. And a lot of this a lot of it ties into like Trump's just like policy at a low level and at a high level. So I wanted to get your perspective on how these like aid diplomacy mergers tie into that, the more global, more wide order.
Great question. Thank you so much. So many big picture questions there that I would probably punt to the incredible experts I see here in the room on big world order questions. I think slightly above my pay grade on some of those really important, huge questions, but maybe a few slices. So you definitely see this idea that aid diplomacy mergers might help increase strategic neighborhoods of influence. That effect, I think, is strongest if you look at the case of Australia. Like I said, they basically dropped their global footprint post-merger and really focused much more explicitly on the Indo-Pacific neighborhood. But there are other cases where post-merger that is a pretty light effect. People still post-merger have spheres of influence all over the world. It's a fascinating question, of course, thinking about all the geopolitics we see today. So I think there could be some sort of question about the mergers and how they relate to more sort of regional spheres of influence questions, but probably for research, maybe for you and others to take forward. And finally, on the US point, yes, the conservative governments being associated with these mergers, I think is definitely critical to note. The US case, I would just add, so when we talked about the acronym soup of all these mergers happening around the world, we saw the FCO and DFID become the FCDO. You see similar kind of language in other countries. the US did not have the State Department become the State and Development Department. So I think we really are dealing with a different kettle of fish here. Again, I mentioned there's component parts I think are important, and I do think there should be some insights valuable for other countries, but the US is such a unique case that you'd have to spend a lot of time thinking about it differently.
Thanks. Sir?
Don Emerson, Senior Fellow Emeritus. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding the overall conclusion, and if I am, please correct me. But my sense of it is that there is no clear-cut yes or no. You haven't shown that mergers are better than silos. You haven't shown that silos are better than mergers.
Yeah.
And in a way that makes sense, because think of the subjectivity, if I can be a little abstract, involved in this distinction. We think of aid as not too distant from empathy, right? We're helping. That's the whole kind of notion. Now, the pragmatism, which can be quite brutal when it comes to policy, is fairly separate. One argument might be, although I'm not sure there's any empirical evidence in favor of it, that to combine the two is to poison both, as to make the pragmatism and realism of the policy all mushy with some notion of, empathy, we're reaching out, we're the best friends you have, and so forth. And then conversely, undermining the moral value, insofar as I can use that term, it's a little tricky, of aid as simply helping another country or another person. This would lead to a conclusion that is very disaggregated. Namely, it depends on the country. It depends on the leadership, it depends on the population, of course, and it depends on how it's done. So there is no easy answer, either in favor of merger or against it. But it does perhaps, and this is my last comment, lead to a kind of wonderfully sort of positive view of, let's call it political anthropology or policy anthropology. You've got to get inside the country to figure out how your assumptions are going to play out on, with regard to this particular population. And I think that's not a bad thing, although a theoretician would be disappointed. I think it's a good thing because it allows us to deal in details rather than in these broad notions of, empathy, whatever.
Would you like to respond?
It's just a really fascinating point. I think you've captured better than I a little bit of the hedgy kind of outcome here. Of course, I would love to have, when I came into the project, I just kind of wanted a yes, no. Are these a good idea? And I think you're right. I didn't do the ideal work as a political scientist of neatly in every box knowing that, this is what you get. But I do think we have a really interesting set of scenarios to learn from where there are sort of on the edges, some pitfalls that these are associated with. And maybe if we had a really thoughtful way of doing this again, if you're set on doing the merger, here are ways to avoid and here's ways to maximize benefits. So that's sort of where I'm landing. But I think you're right that it's really the granular micro level, the hard, difficult work on the detail. And it could be that merging sort of climate development work and climate diplomacy has some real fruits and makes a lot of sense. But actually on infrastructure, there's a lot of problems. In the book, I would talk a little bit about Power Africa in the US, how different, when interviewees I worked with in the US all said, well, that worked well. We kind of all came together around a strategic mission, and actually blending development diplomacy there makes a lot of sense. Oh, but on health, maybe not. And we had an interesting conversation about how there might be benefits too. So I think that's the messiness of this topic, and there's not an easy answer. But I really appreciate that's a really valuable comment.
Yes, I'd like to two-finger that comment. Oh, I'm Maria from CDDRL. I'd like to two-finger that comment and also respond, kind of react to your own thoughts about, sometimes I think aid is a typical example of where the normative goal may not align with what the actual outcomes are. You may want to achieve some empathetic goal, but the evidence does not support that what you're doing is actually helping you achieve this empathetic goal. But because you're so tied to this normative goal of how you do things and what you want to do, you continue to do that. So even when we've had, prior to this big collapse, there's been lots of articles about, oh, we need to reform the system. It's not working. Mm-hmm. Of course, nobody expected it to be reformed in the way that it was, but clearly the normative goal was not achieving the outcomes that people wanted it to achieve. So I think that sort of aid has always had this messiness. And because there are just so many outcomes that people are interested in, and maybe this works for this outcome, but not this other outcome. And so I'm not sure that you, even with a merger, you can say clearly, oh, we've made improvements in aid effectiveness, because we don't even know what that is exactly, right?
I just really take your point. I think these are really important. And I think, you know, if you deal with the messiness of policy, of course, no bureaucratic design guarantees a substantive outcome. But I think some sort of humility on that level and recognition of these tensions is needed, and politicians aren't often very explicit about that fact. So I think these are really valuable interventions.
Awesome.
Austin Gruber, visiting scholar here at CSAC. My question relates to your interview specifically. As a sort of a qualitative type of subject here, did you see disparities in level of leadership within the organization as far as how they perceived mergers?
That's a great question. So I did stratify interviewees based on different working levels. I saw almost surprising, but a fair amount of consistency that was more revealing views that were the same based on domain rather than on seniority. But there was a much more antagonistic sense of upset and fervor at the working level. So I think they really suffered the brunt of the chaotic components of mergers that tend to occur. The leadership level also, there were some negative and some positive. There are some hyper negative perceptions of these changes, but their answers tend to be much more focused on questions of longing for the strategic goals that they once owned for many years. So there's some development practitioners that were really excited about mergers. They had some really big picture views of the gains that they saw in their work, but it tended to be the personality of a particular leader who was able in the new agency to stake a claim and build something, and that was slightly reduced at the working level. But definitely, I think surprisingly so, some consistency much more on the domain level than on hierarchy.
So we have about 7 more minutes. So I'll take about 3 and together. Please make your questions succinct, and then we'll have Dr. George respond to them in a bunch. So first, you, sir.
Henry Edwards, University of London, and Triple Helix Institute in Lombardy. So I'm going to suggest turning the lens around. Instead of looking at it from the perspective of the donors, the view from the recipients, who often have their own objectives. And I could give you examples from personal experiences in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and elsewhere, how the process is seen from the other side. And you're probably aware of these as well. And also take a longer term historical perspective, and not only political, but also religious, especially the missionary influence on this. And we saw that come out just recently when a few US religious leaders got a hold of the president's ear, and before you know it, there was a bombing raid on Sokoto, on a Muslim village, who villagers were quite surprised to see the F-16s raining down upon them.
Let me ask you to present the question. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, sir. Thank you. All right.
And I was just thinking it aligns with the local perspective as I think a really important next research component.
So we'll take one here and I guess one more follow-up. So our last 2 right here. So go ahead. 1, 2, and then we'll...
Senior studying international relations. I'm here because I want the jobs, and oh, thank you, and feeling concerned about that for myself and others at the age of 21. So I'm curious if you're seeing any insights. Is there a rise in NGOs stepping into this space? Who's filling the gap if governments aren't doing it, and where can people like me apply for jobs?
And last one as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so do you think that governments are automatically going to, at what point do you think they're going to like realize these pitfalls of mergers, or do you think they're ever going to? And like specifically like in the case of the US, how do you think that would play out, and what specifically do you think needs to be done in order to make the merger actually effective?
Thank you both. So excited that you're on the market, and we need people like you. I'm sorry, we're all here for you, and it's a really important time, I think, as young person thinks about stepping into the system that's been broken for a while. I don't have a perfect answer here again, but I would say I think studies need to come now in terms of actually mapping what this has done to the aid sector in terms of what the US did. The US, of all the countries that I examine, it blows out of the water in terms of absolute spending and overall effect on the aid system overall. So what's happening here in the US really matters. There is a sense that the private sector is plugging that gap to some degree. I think, interestingly, a lot of the development practitioners I talked about are really excited about the private sector. Some of them had some of their most effective work in partnership with it. They see it as the potential lifeline for their work. So yes, making government do this better is really critical. But I was really struck by how much even those deeply entrenched in the government system have hope and optimism about the potential for the private sector. So maybe a place for you to have an impact, government too, right? That government's going to be there for a long time. If you believe in debt aid, there's still going to be someone in F doing foreign assistance, in the U.S. government. They should be a Stanford bright student who really cares. So I think there's some effects to be seen, but important work really to be done no matter where. And what should we do in the U.S.? I would love to hear from the others here in the room who have been in these shoes and have thought about this. For me, I think folks I talk to have really interesting perspectives, but I've been struck by there's a sense USAID will not be reborn. There's just like a sense that that's just the way it is. But also even those who are most critical of this reform saying it maybe should not be reborn, which is interesting, right? If you think these mergers, there is evidence to say that they can be real failures. There's a real problem when you have a merger. Even those people who talk about that don't necessarily say we should have the recreation of USAID. I'm still thinking this through. It's a tough one. But yeah, how do you all think about that? I'd love to hear, over coffee, how you think about that. Would a democratic government come in and rebuild aid in a different way than we saw in the past? I think these are the really critical questions for the future of this topic.
Andrew, just since there are 2 minutes to spare, can I, just on the job question, can you just say something about the impact of the cuts to USAID on the NGO sector?
Yeah, so let's talk about some personal people who have all worked at aid, and it's been tough. So the sense of cutting down USAID's economic footprint has led to major hemorrhaging of jobs. I don't know if that's what you had in mind. There's this definite cutback in the shutdown of NGOs, both in the US, the Beltway bandits that were long accused of absorbing the money, having effects, but also the local implementing partners all having to shut down. I've been working on a project in Sudan, which is absolutely horrific in the midst of civil war, the shutdown of all of these critical development lifelines for people in that country right now. But there is some innovation. I haven't seen some of the metrics that have fully measured this, but there's some siphoning now of money. Some of it's private finance to plug gaps. I've seen these really interesting pooled funds that are now rising to take where USAID money has been displaced. I don't know, Jim, if you have a sense of kind of, I think it's a
no, I just know lots of people who are working at NGOs who lost their jobs because of the cuts at AID. So
overall, I think, yeah, job
I'm just trying to, where so maybe the private sector is where she should look. So yeah, co-term.
ERIs, they're taking a lot of people.
Okay.
Belt and Road Initiative.
I know.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting talk, Rachel, and shedding some light on this vital issue. We look forward to you coming back and telling us all the answers to all the questions we were raised today and what happens with the U.S. case in the future. But anyway, join me in thanking Rachel for